We're going to move into the issue of civil rights. And I want you to know kind of off the bat that President Kennedy had a great love for civil rights. He believed in civil rights. The problem was he doesn't live long enough to really do anything about it. And the torch will be passed on civil rights to Vice President Johnson, who will assume the presidency, who really becomes our greatest civil rights president. He really does, which was a very difficult thing for him because he was a Southerner, okay, and the South wasn't ready for that. Yep, but here. Assassination is next, yep. Well, that'll be a lot of time, and then we'll go into Johnson's administration.
So, are we still going to watch that?
If when it comes out, we sure will.
Which
Jack.
We're going to learn anything about him,
Yeah, later. All right, so our overall topic is President Kennedy and civil rights, and we're going to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And some of this will be a little bit of repeating of what we've talked about, so you can kind of decide what you want to write down as we go through this. I can just tell you this, that civil rights was a troublesome topic for President Kennedy when he took over as the office of president. It was an issue. It was an issue that really started back in 1954 with the Brown versus the Board of Education decision of Topeka, Kansas, we talked about, which desegregated schools. The landmark Supreme Court decision, along with Martin Luther King Jr.'s courageous stand in Montgomery, Alabama, including Rosa Parks. And as we mentioned before, the stand at Montgomery and the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, really made Martin Luther King Jr. the leading spokesman for the civil rights movement in America. The problem is that the Eisenhower administration really didn't do a lot about civil rights. They tried to ignore it. And Kennedy's philosophy was not to do that. He was very much for the equal rights of the black man. And so he's going to try to make some efforts in it. Again, the sad thing is before anything really gets done on his part, he's going to be assassinated. Now, the biggest concern for Dr. King in the 1960s was the establishment of what we call Jim Crow laws. Okay, anybody know what Jim Crow laws are? There, as Brooke pointed, drinking fountain, colored, white, colored entrance only, colored waiting room. Jim Crow laws were laws that discriminated against Negroes in America. And we've talked about some of these before. I have some examples in here. Negroes being forced to sit at the back of the bus or stand when a seat became available for a white person. There's a Jim Crow law. That was a law that stated that Negroes had to either sit in the back of the bus or stand and give their seat up to a white person. Okay, that's a discriminatory law known as a Jim Crow law. Public establishments such as hotels and restaurants that were banning Negroes, drinking fountains that were for separate colors, colored entrance only could come in one particular place, etc. We talked, I think, about the Vince Lombardi story where he went into the restaurant and asked if they served coloreds in this restaurant, and the guy said, yeah, how do you want them cooked? Coaches that in those days in the NFL had to find places that would allow blacks and whites to stay in the hotel. Okay, told you the story about Ernie Davis, who won the Heisman Trophy, who won the Most Valuable Player Award in the Cotton Bowl in the 1960s, and when they were going to give him this trophy as the MVP, he couldn't go get it because they held it at the golf course that banned Negroes. So I mean, there were crazy laws like this. And because of these Jim Crow laws and all these issues of civil rights in the 1950s, in 1950, Martin Luther King Jr. formed an organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Because of discrimination and Jim Crow laws, Martin Luther King Jr. formed an organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And some of the men that joined with him to establish that will be names we'll talk about later and in the future. Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shutterworth, Bayard Rustin. These were just some of the men who helped Martin Luther King Jr. start the organization known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shutterworth, Bayard Rustin. If you look up here, you'll see a picture of Ralph Abernathy in front of the SCLC. This is more commonly known with a signature here, which he signed in 1974. But it was Ralph Abernathy, Bayard Rustin, Fred Shutterworth, and others that helped Martin Luther King Jr. form what we know as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC for short. The organization was based in Atlanta, Georgia. That's where it was based. And the purpose of the SCLC was to plan peaceful demonstrations throughout the 1960s for two reasons. Okay? The idea, the philosophy, the goal of the SCLC was to plan many different peaceful demonstrations. And they did so throughout the 1960s for two specific reasons. The reasons they had peaceful demonstrations was, one, to end segregation across the United States, and two, simply to end discrimination across the United States. So the whole purpose behind the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was to plan peaceful demonstrations across the country during the 1960s that would end segregation in the United States and end discrimination in the United States. Now, I got to tell you, I'm not a preacher here, but I want to talk about a sermon that Martin Luther King Jr. gave in 1957. And he gave this very, very famous sermon at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. So in 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. gave one of his most famous sermons in history at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And at the time that he gave this sermon, he had a lot of enemies during the Civil Rights Movement. He just had a lot of people that did not like him. And this whole sermon might give you a thought process of how to deal with your enemies, because he had a very interesting philosophy on haters, so to speak, okay? Before you call them haters. So as I mentioned, Dr. King had many enemies during the Civil Rights Movement, and he strongly believed that the only way to deal with your enemies was not to hate them, but to love them. And this famous sermon was entitled, obviously, Love Your Enemies. Okay, we maybe can all learn something here. So the topic of Dr. King's sermon in 1957 at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery was Love Your Enemies. And it stressed these 3 steps on how to do that. I mean, you might think about that. It might be kind of hard to love your enemy. He's going to give you 3 steps on how to love your enemies. First step on how to love your enemies was to look at yourself and ask yourself this question. Why do I have enemies? Okay, why do I have enemies? So the first step of his Love Your Enemies sermon on that date, 1957, is to look at yourself and ask the question, why do I have enemies? Now, if you think about that, it's kind of like, this is kind of off topic, but I learned a long time ago from Lou Holtz, who was a coach at Notre Dame for a long time. And I was listening to one time, and I was a young administrator. You know, if you're an administrator, you get criticized all the time. If you're a coach, you get criticized. Whatever. In life, you get criticized. And Lou Holtz said, and this is kind of what I think what Martin Luther King's saying, why do I have enemies? So, when you get criticized, the first thing that you look at is the person that's criticizing you. And you think to yourself, do I have any respect for this person that's criticizing you? And if you have no respect for the person that's criticizing you, then you don't pay any attention to the criticism. Why would you? Why would you waste your time? Secondly, if you get criticized and you look at the person that's criticizing you and you respect the person, then what do you have to do? You gotta look in the mirror and really pay attention to what they're criticizing you about. Then you have to make up your mind if you're going to agree with them and you're going to change, or you're going to agree to disagree and go on with life. But the first thing you do is you look at the person that criticizes you and see if you have any respect for him. If you have no respect or regard for him, don't waste your time worrying about the criticism. But if the person that criticizes you is someone you respect, take a look at the criticism and decide if they have a point, you got to change. If they don't really have a point or you don't agree, you agree to disagree and move on. Okay? So when he's saying is, why do I have enemies? It's the same type of thing. You need to look at yourself and see if you're the cause. Second step in his love your enemy speech was you got to find an element of good in your enemies. Find an element of good in your enemies. Now, Dr. King's philosophy was that all people were made in the image of God, therefore all people have some good in them. Okay? All people have some good because they were made in the image of God. And you needed to dig deep and find out a little bit of good in your enemies and emphasize the good rather than the bad. And the third step that he gave in his love your enemies speech is when the opportunity arises to defeat your enemy, refrain from doing so. When the opportunity arises to defeat your enemy, refrain from doing so. Instead of payback, choose what? Okay? You got a chance to defeat your enemy, get payback. Instead of payback, forgive them. He believed in forgiveness over payback. So his third part of his love your enemy speech was when the opportunity arises to defeat your enemy, refrain from doing so. There will always be opportunity to pay people back. Instead of paying them back, choose forgiveness. Now, he continued his sermon on ways you could love your enemies. And he talked about 3 specific areas of loving your enemies: violence, hate, and love. Okay, now I thought this is kind of interesting. And again, not a religious guru here, but he talked about how to love your enemies concerning violence. Now think about this. He stated you should dim the lights on violence. Dim the lights on violence. So let's kind of use an analogy. 2 cars are coming at each other, both with their brights on. And by God, what are you going to do? You're not going to give in. You're going to wait until that guy dims his lights before you dim yours. Pretty soon you both are a couple of knuckleheads. Okay, you got a couple of knuckleheads going at each other. Neither one dims their lights, and what happens? You have a crash. Somebody gets killed and you have an accident. King's point is these 2 cars are coming at each other, both with their brights on. Neither driver can see worth a darn, which could cause a major collision. Some one of the 2 has got to be smart enough to dim their lights so that both aren't injured in the process. So someone has to come to their senses and dim their lights. And I've seen it a million times. My dad was horrible at that. That blankety blank's got his brights on. Well, dim yours. No, I'm not dimming mine till he dims yours. Well, pretty soon, what do you got? What have you gained there? Nothing but frustration. Martin Luther King says with violence, dim your lights. Be the one that dims your lights to avoid the collision. Okay? That's what he said about violence. Hate. Now this is a great story. Dr. King believed that hate distorts the personality of the hater. I'm going to give you the best example I can give you on this. Dr. King believes that hate distorts the personality of the hater. Hate distorts the personality of the hater. You know what the perfect example of that is? You know what it is? Fantasy football. I swear my wife opened my eyes to this. I like football. I love to get up on Sunday morning and sit on my butt on the couch and watch football all day. My wife told me, "Who are you since you started fantasy football? You're not the same guy that used to sit and enjoy football. You're pissed off all day long because your guy got stopped at the 1-yard line and your opponent's guy ran it in for the touchdown. You don't even watch football the same way you used to. Who are you?" You've changed your personality totally because you're hating so much. And that's, I thought to myself, I'm not playing fantasy football next year because she's right. I'm mad the whole Sunday because my guy ran to the 1 yard line and her guy ran in for the 6 points and then I lose. Or I was in a game last year that was for a little bit of money and my guy's running around the side and if he scores I win and he fumbles, which cost me 2 points, and I lost by 1. And I'm yelling and my wife says, no more. So I'm hating football so bad that the hate distorts my personality. I'm not even the same guy watching football. And that's what he's saying. If you hate so much, you aren't even yourself. And if a person hates, the hate changes who you really are. And I believe my wife, I have not watched football the same since I started fantasy football. I'm giving it up. It's too stressful, right? Okay? How he talked about loving your enemies in the area of love. You know, we don't love enough. You know, it's kind of a weird deal. Everybody gets wound up if you say, gee, we love you. And there's nothing wrong with that. And there's different levels of love. You know what I mean? But Dr. King preached that love has transformative power. It really does. It's a very special power that can transform a person into a better individual. Sometimes it's hard to say that. Sometimes saying you love someone, saying you forgive them. Sometimes you're too mad to forgive. And all this goes through. The point I'm trying to make here on this whole thing on this love your enemy speech is that Martin Luther King believed totally in a nonviolent approach to civil rights. Everything he did was nonviolent. Did he pay the price? He and his followers got the hell beat out of him on many, many occasions. Okay? And as the civil rights movement struggled, and we'll talk about this later when we get into the late 1960s, radical black leaders start to stand up. And the Black Power movement comes. And the movement transfers from the nonviolent approach of Martin Luther King to a violent Black Panthers, Black Power feeling of civil rights. And so it's important you understand where Martin Luther King Jr. is. He was totally into forgiveness and love and nonviolence in the civil rights movement. Okay? Well, that'll take us to where the Kennedy administration stood on civil rights. And again, President Kennedy's not going to have enough time in office to really make a huge dent, but he is going to do some things that are important to civil rights. Because when he took office, he strongly believed the federal government should pass laws to guarantee equal rights to Negroes. No question about it. And obviously, when Kennedy took over, it wasn't a time in American history where most Americans, and you know, especially white Americans, thought that should be the case. Okay? Remember, civil rights was a major campaign issue in 1960. Kennedy openly criticized the Eisenhower administration during the campaign for not doing enough in this area. And remember that the support Kennedy received from Martin Luther King Sr. proved to make a huge difference in the outcome of the election. Remember that story where he was for Nixon at first, and then when Kennedy called Coretta Scott King when her husband was in jail, to change the table. Well, I'm going to give you 3 things that President Kennedy did early in his administration to improve the civil rights issue. Okay, 3 things. First thing he did is he created an organization called the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, better known as the CEEO. He established the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. President Kennedy established the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. What that organization did is that any business or any company that worked for the federal government had to give every person, no matter their race, an equal opportunity for employment. He could control the businesses, etc., that worked for the federal government, right? And he still said, if you're going to work for the federal government, and we're going to pay you, you're going to make sure that every person, no matter their race, would have an equal opportunity for employment. It's a good start. So his formation of the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity did give Negroes a better shot at jobs with companies and businesses that worked for the federal government. Second thing he did is he told his brother Bobby at the Justice Department that he needed to get behind supporting the efforts of blacks to vote in the Deep South. A lot of blacks were not voting in the Deep South. Fear of retaliation, beatings, etc. Very few blacks actually in the Deep South were exercising the right to vote under threat, repercussion, and violence. And so he told Bobby Kennedy, you get the Justice Department on the stick and you help those black voters feel comfortable to go to the polls so they do not have to fear violence, repercussion, threat, etc. So Bobby Kennedy now is going to get on the stick here and he's going to help support efforts of blacks to vote. And you're going to get some examples of this later. So he establishes the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, and he directs the Justice Department under the direction of his brother, the Attorney General, to get behind blacks so they can vote in the Deep South. And then the third thing he did is he made some key appointments in his cabinet. And obviously he gave those jobs to who? African Americans. Okay? First thing he did, this is the first time in history this ever occurred, is he named Carl T. Rowan U.S. Ambassador to Finland. Carl T. Rowan, U.S. Ambassador to Finland. Here's Carl T. Rowan right here. That was kind of interesting for Saskia when she was here because she was from Finland. And Carl T. Rowan became U.S. Ambassador to Finland, first African American ever to serve in that capacity. He also appointed another black man by the name of Andrew Hacker, Associate Press Secretary.